Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for allowing me to speak with you all today. I had seen Zach's invitation on the Clojure and Slack, knew it coincided with our trip to Asia, and really glad to be able to take this chance to meet some folks online who, yeah, it's really cool to see that Clojure goes around the world. And this talk, I'm mostly going to be storytelling. It's going to be history of our company. We're about 4 years in. And there's kind of a two-pronged theme to the story, I guess, because, yeah, a company, this book over here talks about it as a socio-technical system. So you think about the technology, you also have to think about the people who are using the technology, and those two things, of course, shape one another. And so when I think of the history of our company as it's unfolded based on Clojure, there really are those two angles on it. One angle is, well, how has this technology worked for us to actually build our systems? The other angle is, well, how have we actually hired, retained, trained, and so on an engineering organization full of human beings using Clojure. So just going to be telling that story mostly. A bit about me. So yes, I'm from Pennsylvania in the States, and I went to university in Philadelphia, which is the city closest to where I grew up. I was a physics major initially, and through physics, I had a few different programming courses. And additionally, there were peripheral requirements. So one semester, my sophomore year, I was shopping for classes, and I looked and I had a hole in my schedule, Tuesday, Thursday, 10:30 to 12. I had a class until then. I had a class after then. And I thought, if I could just find something for that hole, then I can get all my classes out of the way. You can see how great of a student I was at the time. And yeah, there was this Korean history after 1860 class that fit that hole, and it filled a requirement. Seemed really interesting. So I checked it out. And yeah, one thing led to another. So right through physics, I had a few programming classes. Through my other studies, I got into Korea and so on. And let's see, my first year out of college, I was a high school teacher. I enjoyed that, but I missed the same kind of quantitative problem solving that I had done as a student, and ended up just getting a job with a research lab, doing Perl on the back end for their research data, neuropsychiatry, pretty good stuff. And then at the same time, was able to enroll part-time in a master's program at the university, which was, computer science if you didn't major in it. So, I think of an analogy with learning a natural language, like say learning Korean. I had the chance to study the language as an undergraduate. I also later would be able to study it in Korea. And you've got to have the classroom instruction or you'll never learn the language. You've also got to have practice outside of that formal environment, or you'll never really be able to use it either. And in this capacity where I was working, my day job for the lab, just, writing software for the purpose of my job, and then having the evening instruction to be able to, learn the formal underpinnings of the discipline was really a perfect circumstance. And yeah, it was the course of doing those master's studies that I developed an interest in programming languages. And initially I got into Scala. There was a Haskell class there and was really into type systems and all of that stuff, and had gotten into the Scala community. But when it came time to find a job, I just was looking more broadly for functional programming, and it just so happened that there was a startup in the Philadelphia area that was a Clojure startup. So I thought, okay, yeah, well, they don't really have, types, but hey, it's still functional, so let's give it a shot. And that also proved to be a really great place to learn the craft of software engineering. In the space of just a couple of years, really leveled up a lot and began to develop a love for Clojure there. But I had this interest in Korea on the side, and had been looking for a chance to actually live there. I had gone on one trip one summer for about 6 weeks and really enjoyed it. Had gotten just a taste of the world beyond the shores of the U.S. and was really looking for a chance to spend some longer time there. At this point, I was coming up on my 30th birthday and decided if I was ever going to go for it, I should go for it soon. And yeah, so I left my job with the startup and had just sort of a freelancing half-time Java consulting job that I did remote from Seoul while I, as I mentioned, enrolled in Korean classes. Along the way, met the love of my life. We got married about 5 years ago, and we settled back in the States, had a little baby girl, and I realized at the time that it was time to come out of retirement. The half-time thing was great for just a single guy in his 20s, but since I was starting a family, I needed to get back in a real job, and just talked to an old colleague from the first Clojure startup who connected me with the CTO of Crossbeam right as we were doing our seed round. And so, yeah, everything just lined up perfectly, and was able to come back to Philly to work for a promising startup in, at the time, what was a Python shop. So I'll get into that story in just a little bit. So yes, Crossbeam, what are we? We basically have invented this category of partner ecosystem platform. And we started 2018 initially in Philadelphia. We've always been a little bit remote first, but the founding footprint, most of the people were in that home city. And as time has gone on, especially with the pandemic, we've of course brought into our hiring more. So the photo here is from last month. We, for the first time post-COVID, were able to fly most of the company out to Scottsdale, Arizona, and have just sort of an offsite gathering to meet everybody. Many of us for the first time. Fun little story here. 2 guys on my team were talking at the beginning of that, and you're supposed to show up, get your COVID test, and until it's negative, wear a mask. So they're just talking to one another, and one says to the other, well, hey, I can't wait to meet Hans. And he says back to him, well, who do you think I am? And Daniel says, well, Matt? No, it was Hans. So yes, we've been working together on this team for well over a year, met one another for the first time in person just last month, and there were all kinds of surprises there, which was great. So a little more about what exactly is our business case, because if you're like me, you have no real idea what is meant when we talk about a partner ecosystem platform. So our target market initially anyway are SaaS companies. So, your company makes software and you sell that software to other companies. And there are partnership relationships that companies have. So I think of a really simplistic example. Let's say, I sell hamburgers, you sell French fries. We're not actually competitors, because somebody who is a customer of your French fries is more likely to want to buy my hamburgers. So we actually coordinate with one another. And it's basically a way to get really good sales leads through your professional network. And this came out of our founder's previous experience with his previous companies, finding that this whole partner tier of the organization just wasn't really served by software at all. And people were doing all of their work, all of their collaboration, essentially in spreadsheets. So, he had moved on from his prior 2 successes and was looking for the next thing. And this idea was really at the top of his list. So, yeah, essentially there's a little bit of a prisoner's dilemma. You each have your sales pipelines. You're not comfortable just completely opening up your entire Salesforce instance to your partner, because yes, you collaborate. Yes, you in some sense are on the same side, but there's not that complete trust. But not being able to collaborate at all, again, that manual world of the spreadsheets is just very inefficient, and you waste a lot of human hours just sort of manually going through things like that. So Crossbeam essentially is a data escrow service. So companies sign up, they connect their CRM, their Salesforce, their HubSpot, their whatnot with us, and they pipe in their full sales pipeline. Then they form their partnership relationships on our platform, just as you go onto LinkedIn and identify who your professional network is. You go on a Crossbeam, you form partnership relationships there, and then you segment your data. You say, here are my customers, here are my prospects, here are my leads, open opportunities, and so on. And then you set up your data sharing relationships where you say only exactly what fields you're comfortable sharing, in which situation. And then essentially when there's an overlap, when let's say your prospect is my customer, Crossbeam notifies you both and says, oh, okay, hey, your prospect is his customer. Why don't you make an introduction for him? Just sort of facilitating and accelerating this sales process and empowering these partnership professionals who, again, didn't really have any tools to make their jobs better and are often driving a lot of value for their organizations, but have difficulty attributing that, putting a dollar sign to that value, saying, oh, actually, this much in our pipeline last quarter came through the partnership organization. So that's essentially the business opportunity that Crossbeam has been jumping on. And so we're into the 4th year now. I guess actually the founders are probably into their 5th year now, and then the first employees are coming up on their 4th years later this year. And it's been going well. We've kind of created this category. We have a little bit of competition. We actually just announced earlier this week that we are acquiring a company that in the early stages look like they might be a competitor. It turns out Partnered is a really good complement to our offering. I had previously worked for a company that didn't actually have that kind of outsized growth potential that startups are supposed to have. And from the beginning, it's been a surprise at Crossbeam how the script has gone kind of according to how success is supposed to look for a startup. And as I mentioned, I was able to join year 1 for this company. And so I've been along for the ride and able to tell the story here, especially as it pertains to Clojure. You can see here, my slide is cut off to the right just a little bit here. The word is just snakes, year 1, founders and snakes. Yes, these are our 2 founders, Bob Moore and Buck Ryan. Bob Moore had started his first company soon after finishing university. It was called RJ Metrics, and had a successful exit. And indeed, that company had also spun off a second offering along the way, which itself was later acquired. So Bob has 2 successful exits under his belt, but hadn't quite gotten the big one, the huge success, and had even flirted with it with RJ Metrics. So if you look up his blog post, my 2.6 billion ecosystem fail, he explains along the way how they initially had traction, but how they made a critical misjudgment wanting to be a platform rather than an ecosystem. And this other company, Looker, saw that potential and didn't miss it, and ended up later on acquired by Google for $2.7 billion. So Bob definitely has a successful track record, and it had sort of a near miss with the sort of meteoric success that you might dream about with a startup, and was just sort of looking for the next big thing. As I mentioned, had sort of a notebook of many ideas, and this one really stood out to him. And then Buck Ryan, our CTO, had previously worked with Bob and was actually out on his own, was trying to do a consultancy. Bob actually used to encourage all of the employees of RJ Metrics to one day go out and found a company. And that was something that part of what Buck was doing in having his own consultancy there. But, Bob was looking for somebody to build a prototype for him. And he just approached Buck because, they had worked together before. And so Buck was tasked with writing this first prototype version of Crossbeam. And this is where the snake comes in. Buck initially was just doing this in a consulting capacity. It was only a little bit later that they decided that he would join as the co-founder and CTO. And so his primary concern in developing that prototype was being able to hand it off later. And so, of course, he ended up choosing Python, a great language for many purposes that he was very fluent in, and knew that he wouldn't have too much trouble handing it off to whoever the eventual steward would be. And yeah, you can see on the left here that initial summer they had interns, just a crew of interns that they were doing a lot of different things in the very early stages of this. But they put their seed round together and made their first hire. So this is our holiday party at the end of that first year, 2018. You can see me over here on the right. Joined as backend engineer number 3. By the way, yeah, this whole story is kind of neglecting the front end side of the equation. Just because this is a Clojure talk for a Clojure meetup, and just going to acknowledge and apologize up front for not giving the whole front end side of our engineering organization and all the great work that we've done there. It's full due. But yeah, we're just for the sake of simplicity, just talking about our work with Clojure here. So yeah, so all right. We're about a year into this, and we actually are closing our first paid pilots. So already we have a little bit more traction than I might have expected. Like, wait a minute, people are already willing to pay a little bit of money for this thing. And Buck is already realizing that his Python service just isn't really going to work for the long haul. And again, as I mentioned, there's 2 dimensions to this. There's, of course, the need for the service eventually to scale technically. But then I think even deeper, there's the trouble of it scaling humanly. So, at this point we have pushing 30 engineers in our organization, and we still view ourselves as early in the stages of our growth. And Buck really had deep misgivings about the ability of Python to really handle all the complexity that all of our teams would end up needing to build on top of it. To say nothing else of technical limitations. We used this object relational mapper for a lot of the really early stuff to get going. And again, it was really great for prototyping, just as the story goes with the RMs. And then, as it always does, you just very quickly reach some growing pains. So it just so happened, right, that the first few engineers hired all had prior Clojure experience. RJ Metrics and Stitch, both of Bob's previous companies, had used Clojure, and the company I worked for, Relay, also was a Clojure shop. So though Clojure isn't the most widely adopted language out there, I think Philadelphia is a little bit of a hotspot for Clojure. And I don't think we were hired to be a Clojure team. We were just hired to be good engineers, but certainly when Buck was making those initial decisions, it didn't hurt that people had Clojure experience, and there's a correlation there with being good engineers. So we had this sort of latent potential as a team, as Clojure devs in our past, and we had this kind of need, knowing that this initial Python service probably just wasn't going to do for the long haul. So that was essentially year 1. So I don't know. This is kind of a wordplay on a wordplay. Of course, people talk about forks in the road. You may have heard someone say, when there's a fork in the road, well, take it. And I'm not sure this is actually coherent, but hopefully it's funny. Year 2, find parentheses sitting in the road, wrap the road in the parentheses. This is the year that we really went for it. And how did our Clojure migration actually come about? So Buck, in his nights and his weekends, was bootstrapping a proof of concept. And yeah, originally we didn't intend to do any kind of grand rewrite. I think it's probably going to be difficult at any stage of any organization's life cycle to say that all of our software, all of our backend systems, we're going to just completely rewrite them. Initially, it was sort of the very core problem that our systems focus on, which is kind of this outer join as a service, where you have your partner data and your data, and we've ingested that all, and we're running matching, and we're knowing what are the overlaps, what are the matches. Buck was just working on a Clojure service to do this operation. And yeah, as his initial thought was, we'll release that and the Python service can coexist with it. But To be honest, that really didn't last too long. So I was on the team for one of the first projects that one of the new features that we added. So, okay, data sharing, you say like, yes, this population, this partner is allowed to see it. But the ability for the partner to say, well, hey, that population you have, could you share it with me? Was a project that I was working on, and it was going to be sort of greenfield, brand new functionality, brand new database tables. We had added another senior engineer to the team who also had Clojure experience, and we were just sort of faced with this fork in the road. Well, do we implement this, in the Python service because it's not this kind of core matching engine? And yeah, I don't have a really clear memory of exactly what our deliberation was in the time, but we just decided to go with it, even knowing that this would mean that we would have to gradually migrate all of our Clojure code, all of our Python code to Clojure. So brand new features, yes, we started implementing in Clojure. Matching engine was in Clojure, and then kind of as each project started for an early phase, we would just sort of try and migrate something piecemeal. And yeah, I had the feeling at the time that Crossbeam was already a really great company to work for, even though I had to sort of hold my nose and write this Python. And so being able to, at this point, I'm living in my home city, working for a successful startup, now also able to use essentially my favorite programming language, really felt like having my cake and eating it too. And yeah, you might wonder though, is this actually going to work out, or are we going to regret this decision? And especially the need to, again, rewrite all of that Python code is one liability. And then another liability is, are you going to be able to recruit for all of the expansive rounds that a startup needs to do with this niche programming language? But yeah, I have to say, as a member of the team at the time, was just really exciting to be able to sort of go for it. Fun little exercise, rewriting Python code in Clojure for work. And then, being able to start to build on top of that in Clojure was a really good thing. But yeah, as I mentioned, along with success comes the need to expand. So we had the seed rounds. It was just a team of about 6 of us, engineers, and then we had a Series A, and we needed to double the team. So we went through a couple of rounds of hiring. Essentially, the Series A and the Series B funding happened a year apart, and each of those different rounds had a little bit of a different profile. So yeah, I think being a Clojure shop, being able to be location flexible, early on, we were able to just hire pretty much from within the Clojure pool. So yeah, I actually brought somebody aboard who I had worked for previously at my prior Clojure job. So of course he already knew Clojure and was stoked to be joining a Clojure shop. Yeah, we hired another developer who had used Clojure in another shop. And then, yeah, somebody who had used Clojure, or I said Clojure, somebody who had used Scala in her job and was looking at different opportunities, but was persuaded to, leave those types behind and jump aboard the Clojure train with us here at Crossbeam. And so kind of essentially through that first round of hiring, it sure didn't look like choosing this language was hindering us, because it was really enabling us to send the signal to recruit the really good engineers who were, looking for that kind of place to hire, that kind of place to work. So a year later, though, again, so now we've grown to about like 8 engineers, and we still need to keep growing. And you're just limited. There are just only so many Clojure developers who are free and looking to switch gigs. So you've got to be able to broaden the pool a little bit. And at this point, Clojure can't just be something that a collection of us happen to already know and like. It has to actually be compelling for somebody who hasn't worked in it. And then you have to be able to teach people how to use it. And that's a challenge. So we hired another senior engineer who had used Java his whole career, and hoped that he would be successful with with Clojure. And yeah, somebody who maintained a Clojure open source project joined us. And then, we're also early on, we hired mostly just senior developers. Early on in the startup lifecycle, you kind of have the necessity and a little bit the luxury of doing that. But once you are expanding past a certain point, you can't just hire senior developers. You need to hire just software engineer, mid-level. You need to even hire associate engineers. And your choice of language needs to work for those as well. So yeah, we've had the challenge of doing all of that. And yeah, I've got just a few slides here motivating exactly why that works for us. So again, the thesis is basically that Clojure is a superior tool for the job. Clubs, anybody can wield a club. It's pretty easy to get up to speed with a club. You could do damage with a club. Swords, on the other hand, if you're not careful, you're really going to hurt yourself. It takes a lot more skill to wield accurately. But really, which would you rather your team use? Would you rather be stuck on clubs? Of course, you would rather, your team have the superior tool for their job. And that's going to contribute to their satisfaction. And yeah, it's going to require that you invest in them and not just think of them as expendable. You want them to be skilled. You want them to become more skilled. And yeah, you want to retain them as opposed to just optimizing for being able to find another body to throw in there if somebody leaves. And yeah, when it comes to training people, in some sense, if you just have an algorithm to implement, the specific language that you're implementing that algorithm in isn't all that difficult. After all, writing lines of code, this is my first mentor at my first Clojure shop, Kyle Burton, all-around great guy, says that writing lines of code is one of the least effective things that an engineer can do. We're reasoning about systems, we're reasoning about problem space, and by the time we get to actually writing lines of code, we're really far down the funnel of the work of an engineer. And so in some sense, being able to teach somebody Clojure isn't necessarily, I compared it earlier to learning Korean. It's not as hard as learning a different natural language. Even though Lisp is a different paradigm than what people are mostly familiar with, we're still not talking about something that is that crazy. When I started at my first Clojure job, we just did pair programming. There was no Clojure onboarding at all, really. You just kind of wrote alongside somebody and gradually learned how to do things. And then, once people do pick it up and kind of have the Clojure way internalized, then very often you've kind of got this hook where, your engineers really appreciate being invested in working for an organization that wants them to have the best tools. And yeah, they get a taste for the superiority of Clojure in many respects, and they don't really want to go back. Hans on my team, sure, he could get a job once again as a Java developer, but he really wouldn't want to. He would want to do Clojure. So Clojure, I mentioned, it helps with recruiting people. It can also help with retaining them because they get accustomed to having more power, and they don't really want to go back to other ways that they've done things. So yeah, that's kind of, as we started expanding the team, the kind of challenges that we started biting up. Yeah, as we came into the year 2020, of course, the pandemic hit. We had always been kind of remote first. I remember the first time that I drove an hour to make it into the office for a developer meeting, and then Buck was just on a Zoom cart in the room trying to make a point that we were going to be a remote first company. So we were always well positioned to make that jump, but it became really clear that we were going to really be doing that. And yeah, it even included some outsourcing. So this was that summer 2020. We were experimenting with different ways to scale the team, and we became acquainted with this Flexiana shop that I think now employs over 90 Clojure devs worldwide. And yeah, we brought a few of those guys on board. And this was actually how I made the switch from being an individual contributor on my team to management. Buck realized, oh, wait, I don't have the time to manage these other developers. And I had the chance to interface with them. And yeah, they made me look really good because they're both really good developers. A lot of organizations have bad stories outsourcing. They're maybe already not a great place to work, and already having trouble hiring people. So they engage with some outsourcing firm, and then just it doesn't solve any of the problems that they have, and now they have more problems, and it doesn't go well. And I think Clojure, again, it's not exactly magic, but because it has these superior aspects, it means that the company that hires the Clojure devs to contract for has a better chance of those devs being good engineers. So yeah, our outsourcing was a really good success. One of the first things that we've got Stefan in Czechia, we've got Mariusz in Poland. One of the first things they did for us was just the last vestiges of the Python service, migrating it all to Clojure. And we've since integrated them just into our teams more properly. And yeah, I really think that Clojure is a big part of the story of the outsourcing success that we did there. But yes, as the year went on and as we'd grown to a certain scale, we realized that we weren't going to be able to be just one flat engineering team anymore. We were going to need some real structure. We were going to need some management, and we were going to need separate teams. So I think this was, the single biggest step that we made in terms of difficulty of transition, or all of the different concerns that were involved. Like, yes, in hindsight, it was a little bit edgy when we migrated the language to Clojure, but the work of going from just one engineering team that's sort of informally organized, where all the engineers are really autonomous and everybody sort of is expected to be able to jump in anywhere in the system, to making that a more proper engineering organization with separate teams that each have their own domains of ownership, is just, really challenging. And so, yeah, that was coinciding with me jumping in. So I manage the Pinto beams. We decided that all of our teams should be named kinds of beam, and we're a bean, not a beam, but we still thought that was fun. And indeed, yeah, our mascot is a can of beans, and we get a lot of enjoyment out of that. But yeah, so I moved into just this role, leading this one team within all of this. And a big part of that was the need to divide our systems. As we've continued to add scale, complexity, features, capabilities, and so on, it becomes just really intractable if you're going to expect any engineer to be able to jump in on any given area of the system. But going from one team to two teams, it's also very difficult to find a natural boundary in the computer systems that corresponds to the boundary in your human resources as well. So I think a big part of all this story, again, is Clojure, with Component especially. So we use Stuart Sierra's library. And what this has given us is a lot of the reason that people move to a microservices architecture without a lot of the downside of that. So we still just have a single repository with all of our Clojure code, all of our backend systems. But Component allows us to put service boundaries in our code, what would be sort of API boundaries of actually different services at runtime in our Kubernetes cluster if we were doing a microservices architecture. So in the course of year 3, yeah, we really didn't have anything like this at all. So going from no components to trying to have really good component hygiene throughout your code base has been quite a journey. We've made a lot of progress there, and it's always a work in progress. But the ability to have all of this change on the human side, continuing to add people, continuing to add capabilities and features without the need to, say, split up our monolith repository at the same time and figure out how we're going to deploy things and the dependencies and all of those things. I think the Clojure Component success story was really true for us. So yeah, from that point, year 4, I would say this year is the year that has been the most like prior years. With the startup, it really felt every 3 to 6 months like it would be kind of a whole different job, a whole different company. We've gone again from when I joined having about 8 people. We're really cracking 100 now, almost at 100 now. And again, it was just a few of us engineers, and now we have almost 10 times as many engineers as we had when I joined. Overall, it's been quite the transition. So things continue to change, and every year does continue to be its own beast. But yeah, I would say that last year was the big year in terms of coming of age, and this year is more trying to build towards more maturity. So the thing about our software organization is just as though you need to keep your production systems, available all the time, 24 hours a day, you've got to keep your engineering organization running, which means you've got to keep all of your engineers, happy, growing, working on high leverage problems for them. And inevitably, people do move on, and you've got to find replacements for them. You've got to continue to try and grow. And so all of those challenges that we were facing are sort of a continuous thing. And yeah, I would say in the past year, Clojure has continued to be a big part of our success story in recruiting. So we hired a staff engineer and a senior engineer on our team in just the last several months. And I neglected to put this in the presentation here, so I'm just going to pull it up really quickly. Crossbeam, Clojure. Yeah. So, right, we had this blog post, why we use Clojure at Crossbeam, that Buck wrote fall 2021, so not even quite a year ago. And we really want to blog more, but this one blog post has gotten us a heck of a lot of mileage. So the staff engineer who joined our team worked for a company that was a little bit vaguely in the same space and was a Clojure enthusiast himself, though it was a Java job. And one day, just Google served him an ad for this blog post. He speculates because of the similarity in keywords of what his previous company did and the fact that he was always searching for Clojure on the side. And well, he couldn't just help but indulge that curiosity, dropped us a letter, and had really good conversations, and ended up being able to welcome him aboard. And yeah, another senior engineer was on the market, found this blog post, and found us, and we were able to hire him. And not even just at the most senior echelons, but in the past year, also recruiting mid-level and associate engineers and being able to see their success story. I'm sometimes a little bit disconnected from the day-to-day work that every single engineer does. I'm not seeing everybody's work all the time. And so I've had a few wow moments as I've come back and I've seen our mid-level engineers and how not only are they able to just simply write an algorithm in Clojure, but how they're really understanding the Clojure way. They're in production, they're working with their REPL, really good tooling with the editors and so on. And so been able to see how it has enabled them to have more power, more impact, more satisfaction. So yeah, we spun out a third team last year. End of the year, we are looking to spin out another team later this year. So we're continuing to evolve the team architecture and grow just as we're doing that in our software systems as well. And yeah, just taking a little step back, some of the additions since Clojure, yeah, it's really hard for me because we've come so far, just think where we were when we started out with that Clojure service. But the amount of complexity that we've added, again, to just this single repository, and had it just continue to run and hum along and not really get in our way is pretty amazing. So at the beginning, we used one of Bob's prior companies to actually do the data pool service, but we internalized that ourselves. And that was one of the first major really complex things that we added to our Clojure service. Kafka is doing a few things for us. Again, it's the technical side, and it's also the human side, is building the boundaries between the architectures of the teams. So just in the last year plus, we've added Kafka and integrated that with Clojure. And yeah, our data model is something, once we pull in the data, to have it performant, able to query, standardize across different data sources. we've gone 3 different iterations on now, and just a heck of a lot of complexity in there. Yeah, we have external APIs now because there is a cloud of integrations that are consuming Crossbeam data. Our third team handles that mostly, but it touches our stuff as well. Really, I could go on and on. We've just added a ton of complexity, a ton of features, again, just to this single repository. And our engineering organization is just not that large. And of course, I'm always a little bit nervous about the continuing growing burden of complexity and thinking about how we can try and always simplify things. But the language has scaled really well and just held up with all that complexity and just really hasn't gotten in our way. So yeah, I wanted to close by talking, just putting in the words of the engineers how they feel about Clojure. So this is a round of quotes from about a year ago. People essentially saying like, Clojure really affected their decision to come work for us. Even they were only looking for Clojure jobs, and that was a non-negotiable criterion for places they were considering. And yeah, also another thing that's great about Clojure, as is alluded by this final quote here, is the community. We often get into arguing matches in our different human communities, and I've definitely been part of communities where, yeah, it seems like half the time people are just griping about other members of that community. On the flip side, going to the Clojure Conj in 2019, my colleague who was new to Clojure was almost wondering if this was a cult, because everybody's just so happy about Clojure. Rich Hickey's always there with his entourage. And it's just wonderful to work in a community of people that really like the language, and that is overall a very positive place as well. Again, it's kind of that human side of the technical thing that we don't always think about. Yeah, I've got some more quotes here as well. Trying to find the window. Yeah, so right, in preparation for a talk I gave recently, I asked everybody, what is it that you love about Clojure? And these are just a few of the sample responses. Simon on our team has a Google Keep note that he keeps handy, so at a moment's notice, he can give the 10 bullet points on why he loves Clojure. Hans, I mentioned, was the Java veteran who joined our team about a year and a half ago, just made coding fun again. And yeah, it's just been a joy to go along with Hans as he's gotten deeper and deeper and become more and more of an expert. Noah just joined our team in the last several months, is the maintainer of a successful Clojure open source project. Again, just has a litany of reasons why Clojure is wonderful. And then again, Pavani, same person who had given this final quote on the slide, emphasizes the community and how Clojure devs come from a varied background, and there's a lot of variety, and it's just a good community. So yeah, in conclusion, Clojure, the choice of Clojure back in year 2, I think has paid off really big time for us. It's this force multiplier that makes each of our developers more powerful, whether that's the most senior developer or whether that's somebody who's earlier in their career just joining our team. And has also been a real edge for recruiting, retainment. That's not just, again, for that already existing Clojure niche, but it's for broadening that pie as well, for training engineers in the underlying principles that are the reason why Clojure and the Lisp tradition that it stands in have a lot to give to the greater computer science community at large. So yeah, we're 4 years in. Bob will say we're just getting started. I said we're just cracking about 100 employees, and he's tended to say that the first 100 will be really the early crew in the long run. And excited to see where Clojure goes, where Crossbeam goes. And yeah, it's been a great ride to be along. So that is essentially what I had prepared. And happy to open it up to any questions.